Bible begins with a story we think we know. A garden, a man shaped from dust, and a woman formed from his rib. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if there was another woman before Eve? One born not from Adam, but alongside him. A figure so independent, so defiant, that history buried her name. Her story doesn't appear in Sunday school lessons, but it echoes through ancient texts, whispered in forgotten corners of Jewish mysticism and medieval folklore. Her name is Lilith. And tonight, we drift softly into the mystery of the woman erased. The one who wouldn't bow, the one who walked away, the one who may have come first. Before we begin, I wonder, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there? Are you walking beneath a quiet sky, lying in bed while the house sleeps, or sitting in stillness with only your thoughts? Wherever you are, I'm grateful you're here. Share your time and place in the comments. I love seeing how far these sacred questions travel. Now, let us wander gently into the mystery of Lilith, the forgotten first wife of Adam. In the sacred hush of beginnings, before Eden echoed with laughter or shame, there is a moment the Bible leaves unspoken. We know the sequence by heart. Adam from dust, Eve from rib, the garden alive with divine breath. But nestled quietly within older stories, ones buried beneath councils and creeds, there is another name, a name absent from Genesis yet pulsing through ancient memory like a ghost that refuses to stay buried. Her name is Lilith. Not a demon in her origin, not yet the twisted figure medieval fear would sculpt her into, but something far older, far stranger. A woman created not after Adam, but with him, from the same clay, equal in breath and bone. Some say she emerged fully formed beside him, not beneath him. She stood not behind, not beneath, but beside. And from the moment of her first breath, she refused to bow. That refusal, quiet, resolute, was the first fracture in paradise. According to the alphabet of Ben Sira, a medieval Jewish text echoing with much older oral traditions, Lilith and Adam fought not over temptation or knowledge, but position. When Adam insisted on dominance, Lilith refused. "Why should I lie beneath you?" she asked. "We were created equal." And when he would not yield, she did the unthinkable. She spoke the sacred name of God, rose into the air, and vanished. She chose exile over submission, autonomy over companionship. The garden remained, but she was gone. Banished not by God, but by patriarchy's need for order. The story does not appear in the Torah. It does not walk through the halls of canonized scripture, but it lives, whispered in the shadows of Kabbalah, tangled in Babylonian demonology, haunting the margins of mystical tradition. Who was this woman who would not be tamed? Was she myth, warning, scapegoat? Or was she the original mirror of divine image, cast aside because she did not fit the narrative? As we ask these questions, something within us stirs, something ancient, primal, hungry for the stories that didn't survive the edit. The very idea of Lilith awakens something buried deep within the human story, the cost of independence, the punishment for refusing to kneel. She was not tempted by a serpent. She was not deceived. She simply said no, and for that, she vanished from scripture, only to reappear in whispers. Some traditions say she fled to the edge of the Red Sea, where angels sent by God begged her to return. She refused. Others say she became a mother of demons, a nocturnal spirit haunting the dreams of men. But perhaps these darker turns came later. Revenge stories penned by those who feared a woman who walked away. What if Lilith was not evil, but exiled? Not cursed, but misrepresented? What if she was the first to know that love without equality is not love at all? To trace her name is to trace a ripple in the human soul, the part of us that resists being defined, confined, controlled. In every age, in every culture, she appears with different names: the wild woman, the dark moon, the untamable soul. She's not just a figure from the past, she is a mirror held to the present. And in reclaiming her story, we do not erase Eve. We expand the beginning. We make room for the mystery, for the possibility that even in paradise, there were voices left out of the telling. Lilith's absence is not emptiness. It is an invitation to listen more closely, to wonder more wildly, to ask what else we were never told. And so we begin here, not with certainty, but with openness, with a willingness to hold both the canon and the forgotten side by side, to look not just at what was written, but what was erased, and to ask, with soft reverence and sacred curiosity, what if the first woman was not the helper, but the challenger, not the rib, but the clay? What does it mean to begin again, this time with both women in the garden? The story most of us were handed begins with a man formed from dust and a woman sculpted from his rib, a helper, a companion, a figure molded to fit beside him. But older echoes in sacred tradition murmur a different origin. They speak of a creation not defined by hierarchy, but of mirror and balance. Two beings shaped not from each other, but side by side from the same holy clay. No rib, no secondary origin, just two souls equal in essence, emerging from the same breath of God, standing on the same ground, eyes level. This is where Lilith's story begins, not in rebellion, but in resonance, with a creation that was never meant to be divided. In these older tellings, God first fashioned both man and woman from the soil of the earth, breathing into them equally, blessing them with the same fire of life. They were not created for each other, but with each other. And in that space of pure equality, a tension was born, not from sin, but from sovereignty. For if both were made with the same light, who leads? If neither bows, who bends? Lilith, unlike Eve, did not wait to be named. She was aware, awake, and unafraid. She spoke, she questioned, she claimed her space. And it was this very strength that made her dangerous, not to God, but to the story that would follow. Because if the first woman refused submission, what would that mean for every woman after? The myth of the rib was not a correction. It was a response. A way to rewrite a beginning that had grown too wild for those who sought control. And so, Lilith was written out, not with ink, but with silence, not with flames, but with forgetting. The clay that formed her cracked and dried under the weight of doctrine, and all that remained was the echo of her refusal. But if we listen closely, we can still feel her presence in the soil beneath our feet, in the wind that stirs without permission, in the moments we say no when the world expects a yes. Her story is not found in the book of Genesis, but in the spaces between its lines. It lives in texts like the alphabet of Ben Sira, where Lilith's name appears with all the quiet defiance of a truth long buried. There we read not of a serpent's whisper, but of a woman's voice, strong, unwavering, unwilling to be diminished. She did not want to rule, only to stand. And when Adam demanded she lie beneath him, she saw not love, but ownership, and she chose exile. That choice, so rare, so sacred, wasn't made in anger, it was made in clarity. She left not because she hated Adam, but because she loved herself too much to become less. She knew her worth, and when no one else would honor it, she walked away. To many, this makes her dangerous, but to others, especially now, this makes her divine. Because in a world still shaped by systems that prefer quiet compliance, Her voice is a song of liberation. She is the reminder that obedience is not the same as goodness, and silence is not the same as peace. In her clay, we find the seeds of self-respect. In her absence, we feel the ache of stories left untold. And perhaps that's why her myth persists, not because it was taught, but because it was felt. Lilith is not just a figure of the past. She is a presence in the present. She is the part of us that resists being molded into someone else's idea of who we should be. She is the breath that stirs when we speak truth, even when it costs us belonging. And maybe that's why her story was buried, not because it was false, but because it was powerful, because a woman who says no can change the world. And a creation that begins with equals threatens every structure built on inequality. So the story was rewritten, the clay reimagined. Eve was formed from Adam, and Lilith became a whisper in the dark. But what was lost in that retelling was not just a woman, it was a way of being, a way of seeing the world not through power and submission, but through presence and respect. And now, centuries later, we are remembering. We are digging through the dust for the pieces of her name, the traces of her breath, the shape of her soul. We are reclaiming the clay, not to rewrite the Bible, but to remember the parts it forgot, to say that the beginning was not as simple as we were told, that before the rib there was the dust, before the helper there was the equal, and before Eve there was Lilith, formed from the same earth, breathing the same air, walking the same ground, and choosing with sacred courage to be whole, even if it meant being alone. Lilith, a name barely whispered in the pages of sacred text, yet one that refuses to die. It lingers like a secret too potent to be forgotten, a syllable heavy with mystery and exile. The ancient world feared names, not because they were labels, but because they were power. To speak a name was to summon, to bind, to know. And Lilith's name was not meant to be spoken, not by men, not by scribes, not by those who sought control over the shape of beginning. It was a name wrapped in warning and wonder, one passed down not through priests or prophets, but through women who saw in her the mirror of their own fire. Her name survives not in canon, but in lullabies meant to ward her off, in spells meant to contain her, in amulets buried beneath cribs. What kind of woman must she have been to become so feared she needed to be forgotten? We are told she steals children, seduces men, rides the night winds in shadows. But were these curses born from truth, or were they punishments for her refusal to obey? Because when a woman says no, in a world built on yes, she becomes a threat. And when she walks away from paradise, she becomes a myth. The earliest mention of Lilith appears not in Genesis, but in Isaiah, chapter 34, verse 14. A strange and solitary reference to a screech owl, or in some translations, Lilith, dwelling among the ruins of judgment. There, in a passage filled with desolation and wild beasts, her name is dropped like a cracked jewel in the dust. No explanation, no context, just the haunting presence of someone who does not belong. And yet, that verse sparked centuries of speculation. Who was she? Why was she there? Why does she appear only once in the sacred text, and yet echo endlessly through the folklore that followed? In Babylonian tablets, Lilith was a wind spirit, sometimes malevolent, sometimes misunderstood. In Sumerian myth, she appears as Lilik, a figure tied to sacred trees and unspoken chaos, but it was in the medieval Jewish tradition that she took full shape, not as a demon, but as a woman who refused to be erased. The alphabet of Ben Sira, written between the 8th and 10th centuries, gave her voice. And what she said was simple: I am equal. I will not lie beneath. In the story, she speaks the ineffable name, the Tetragrammaton, the holy arrangement of letters meant only for God and prophets. She does not just flee, she ascends. She leaves Adam and the garden by invoking the divine, lifting herself into the air like smoke that cannot be caught. God sends angels, Senoi, Sansenoi, and Samangeloth, to bring her back. They find her by the Red Sea, wild and free, surrounded by demons and refusing return. They plead, they threaten. They promise her 100 of her children will die each day if she does not come back. And she accepts the curse. She chooses loss over submission. What does that mean really? That she would rather endure the death of her offspring than return to a man who would not see her as equal? It's a haunting, aching choice. One that suggests not cruelty, but clarity. That a life half lived, half respected, half seen, is no life at all. And so her name becomes taboo. Not because it is dark, but because it shines too brightly on the cracks in the story we were told. A name that reminds us that the first fall may not have been from a tree, but from equality. That the first exile was not the result of temptation, but of independence. To speak Lilith's name, then, is to unearth a suppressed truth, not just about her, but about ourselves, about the stories we're allowed to tell, and the ones we've been taught to fear. Because when we speak her name now, in classrooms, in quiet prayers, in poems and protests, we are not summoning evil. We are summoning memory. We are remembering that the divine breath breathed into man was the same breath breathed into woman. That the clay of one was the clay of both. That silence too can be rewritten. The church tried to warn us with images of Lilith as a night hag, a temptress, a thief of babies. But what if those were just masks laid over a deeper truth? That the woman who refused to be used, the woman who left instead of submitting, became too dangerous to remain a woman. And so she became a monster, not because she was monstrous, but because she was free. This is the pattern after all. Strong women become myths, powerful women become warnings. But now, in the age of rediscovery, we are no longer afraid to say her name. We are ready to ask what her story has to teach us, not just about gender or equality, but about the cost of exclusion, the power of origin, and the sacred act of remembering what was buried. So we say her name again, Lilith. And with each utterance, we draw her story back into the light. The story could have ended when Lilith rose from Eden, when she spoke the sacred name and disappeared into the wilderness beyond the garden's edge, but it didn't. What followed was not silence, but a divine attempt to retrieve her, a celestial search through the desert, across waters, through realms where breath still shimmered with the fresh scent of new creation. According to the alphabet of Ben Sira, God, seeing Adam's distress at being alone again, sent 3 angels to find her, Senoi, Sansenoi, and Samangeloth. Their names are strange to modern ears, like echoes of another dimension, syllables formed from wind and fire, meaning cloaked in time. But in ancient texts and amulets, they appear again and again, guardians of children, protectors of sleep, agents of divine order. Their mission was not destruction, but restoration. They were to bring Lilith back, to urge her to return to the man she left behind, to convince her perhaps that peace was better than solitude, that submission was safer than defiance. We don't know how long it took them to find her, only that they did. And when they did, she was no longer the same. She was no longer the clay-formed companion, the newly awakened woman of Eden. She was something wild, luminous, powerful, a woman reborn in exile. Some stories say she had already begun to mother a multitude of spiritual beings. others that she ruled the edges of reality where form begins to blur. The angels found her near the Red Sea, a place symbolically rich with departure and deliverance. The same waters that would later part for Moses had already whispered around her feet. She stood in defiance, the scent of salt and sovereignty in the air. They pleaded with her, reminded her of her place, warned her of the consequences of remaining apart. But she, firm and composed, refused, not with rage or rebellion, but with a sorrowful clarity that shook even the heavens. "I will not return," she said. "I was made equal, and I will not be less." And with that refusal came a punishment, not from God directly, but from the system she had defied. The angels told her that for each day she remained apart from Adam, 100 of her children would die. It is a line that haunts, a grief not often spoken in theological circles. What does it mean to bear the cost of selfhood in children never held, in spirits never named? The myth turns dark here. Lilith, according to the stories, became a mother of demons, her offspring not innocent but cursed. But even this may be a distortion, a later addition from patriarchal fear. Because what is a demon but a being misunderstood? What is a curse but a label placed upon the disobedient? In truth, we do not know what she created. We only know that the price of her autonomy was profound, that the heavens did not ignore her, but neither did they embrace her. The angels returned to Eden without her, and God, in response, created Eve, not from dust, but from Adam's rib, from man for man, a new woman, gentler, quieter, shaped not alongside but beneath, and Lilith's name was left out of the record. The angels, though, were not finished. In Jewish mysticism, their names appear again, not as messengers, but as protectors. Amulets bearing their names were placed in nurseries and worn by mothers to guard against Lilith's alleged vengeance. She, who had lost so many children, was now said to seek the children of others. It is a bitter irony, perhaps even a cruel one, to turn a grieving mother into a night terror. But such is the way of stories written by victors. The angels were not demons. They were not warriors. They were intermediaries between heaven and the earth's untamed edges. They were perhaps the last divine figures to see Lilith and speak to her with reverence. Even as they delivered warnings, even as they tried to retrieve her, they did not curse her. They listened. And in that act of listening, her story was preserved, not in scripture, but in symbols, in names etched in silver and worn on chains, in bedtime prayers whispered in ancient tongues. Lilith was not erased completely because she had been seen, and being seen, even once, has a power no erasure can undo. What remains is attention. 3 angels, a woman who chose the wilderness, and a world unsure what to make of her choice. But if we lean into the silence between the verses, we hear something sacred, a truth not spoken but felt, that freedom, even divine freedom, comes with cost, that equality, once touched, can never be untouched, and that the angels who sought to bring her back may not have failed. They may have simply witnessed her becoming something other, something wholly her own. When Lilith vanished into the wilderness, when she lifted herself from Eden on the wings of divine breath and disappeared into the untamed silence beyond paradise's borders, something shifted in the script of creation, not in what was said, but in what had to be said next. Adam remained, not broken, but bewildered, incomplete in a garden that no longer felt whole. And in that quiet absence, the second woman was formed, not from the same earth that made man and woman equals, but from man himself, from his rib, his side, his own body. Eve was not a replacement. She was a correction, a reimagining of womanhood in a world no longer willing to risk a voice too strong. Where Lilith stood beside Adam and said, "I am your equal," Eve was molded to walk behind, to lean toward, to obey. And while she too would eventually question, taste, awaken, her story began independence. The rib became a metaphor as much as a material. She was not created beside Adam, but from him. And this shift, though subtle in language, marked a profound departure in theology, in society, in how womanhood would be told for millennia. The first woman, fierce and free, was gone. The second woman, beautiful and obedient, was here. This rewriting was not accidental. It was surgical, a removal of autonomy wrapped in poetry. And yet, Eve was not weak. She, too, reached for knowledge. She, too, acted against the grain. But her fall was framed as temptation, her curiosity as failure, her hunger for wisdom as sin. The story became one of blame, and she bore it. But what if her story was never meant to carry all the weight? What if the real fall happened before the fruit was touched, when Lilith was erased, when equality was exchanged for hierarchy, when woman was no longer born of God's breath, but of man's bone? In the space between Lilith and Eve is a chasm of forgotten possibility. A garden that could have held two equals, now restructured to hold one authority and one support. And yet, even in this retelling, the traces of Lilith remain, in the fact that Adam needed another, in the lingering sense that something about the first version of creation was too wild, too unpredictable to maintain. Eve enters a world already altered by loss, and her silence in the beginning chapters of Genesis speaks louder than words. She is present but not heard, named but not known, touched but not voiced, until the serpent, until she speaks, until she chooses. It is in that moment that echoes of Lilith rise again, not in defiance but in decision, in the act of choosing something other than obedience. Some theologians across time have tried to reconcile the two stories, suggesting that perhaps Genesis 1:27, where God creates male and female at the same time, refers to Lilith, and Genesis 2:22, the rib story, refers to Eve, that there were two creations, two beginnings, two women, one forgotten, one remembered. And if that is true, if even the ancient scribes could not silence the ripple of the first woman, then perhaps the Bible itself is not trying to hide her, but dares us to look more deeply, to notice that the first woman was unnamed in the text, that her absence is not emptiness but invitation. Eve's birth from Adam's rib may have been an act of mercy, God giving man another chance at companionship, but it was also an act of caution, a woman who could not walk away because she was shaped from him, a bond not just of spirit, but of dependence. And yet, even this story does not end in simplicity, for Eve, too, breaks the mold. She reaches for the fruit. She questions the command. She becomes, in her own way, a seeker of truth. And perhaps that is the inheritance of Lilith. Not her exile, but her hunger. Not her punishment, but her courage. Perhaps every woman in Scripture who dares to speak, to challenge, to lead, carries a piece of the first woman's breath. From Miriam to Deborah to Mary Magdalene, the voice of Lilith pulses beneath the surface, not as rebellion, but as remembrance. And so we sit with this paradox, that the story of woman in Scripture begins not with obedience, but with refusal, not with harmony, but with tension. And that in the clay and the rib, in the earth and the bone, there are two truths, two beginnings, two women, one lost, one found, both sacred. Long after the dust of Eden had settled and the canonical pages had turned their gaze elsewhere, Lilith remained, not in the spotlight of doctrine, but in the flickering shadows of mysticism, where sacred truths and unsettling mysteries coexist. It is within the folds of Kabbalah, the intricate mystical system of Jewish thought, that Lilith takes on a new dimension, not merely as a forgotten woman or a banished being, but as a complex spiritual entity, a necessary presence in the divine order of the cosmos. In the Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah, written in the 13th century and cloaked in layered symbolism, Lilith appears again and again, not as a cartoon villain, but as a figure born of cosmic imbalance, of light and shadow woven together in the spiritual fabric of the world. She is often paired with Samael, an angelic being also associated with rebellion and divine wrath. Together, they form what some mystics call the other side, the Sitra Achra, the realm not of evil per se, but of divine concealment, where holiness hides behind veils of contradiction. Here, Lilith is not merely a demon, but the queen of the night, the feminine counterpart to divine justice gone awry, the consequence of imbalance, of separation, of forgetting. She becomes the shadow of the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of God's presence, the mirror held up to divine compassion, showing what happens when that compassion is withdrawn. The Kabbalists did not fear Lilith in the way folklore did. They studied her. They decoded her. They placed her in diagrams of the soul and of the universe on the tree of life and the Kulifoth, the shadow tree, showing that even in exile her presence had meaning, that in a universe built on polarity, even the first woman's fall had purpose. Her defiance, once seen as rebellion, became a catalyst. Her independence, once punished, became part of the sacred geometry of choice and consequence. The mystics spoke of Lilith not to demonize, but to understand, to trace the sacred into even the most forbidden corners, because to exclude her entirely would be to deny the truth of the human soul, that light alone is not enough, that without the darkness, the stars have nowhere to shine. In Kabbalah, Lilith's connection to sexuality is prominent, but not in a profane sense. Instead, she is tied to the misuse of creative energy, the distortion of desire when not grounded in holiness. She is seen as seducing those who seek power without reverence, intimacy without union, domination without love. In this way, Lilith becomes a warning, not against desire itself, but against detachment from the sacred within it. She is not lust. She is longing disconnected from soul, and in that, she is deeply human. The mystic's understanding of Lilith is nuanced, one of paradox. She is necessary and dangerous. She is a part of the divine mystery and a force that must be held in balance. They knew she could not be destroyed, only acknowledged, understood, transformed, which is perhaps the deepest truth of all. That which we exile does not disappear, it waits, and what we call evil may sometimes be the shadow of what we will not face in ourselves. In the prayers and rituals of the Kabbalists, amulets and names are still invoked to protect against Lilith, but also to honor the power she represents. The power of choice, the power of voice, the power to say no, even when heaven expects a yes. Her name is inscribed not just in warnings, but in diagrams of the soul. She is not only outside Eden, she is within the human psyche, the part of us that will not conform, that longs for something deeper than obedience. And perhaps that is the true reason her story persists, not because she is feared, but because she is recognized, in dreams, in mirrors, in moments of quiet rebellion. She's the sacred feminine untamed, the part of us that chooses exile over erasure. And the mystics knew this. They saw in Lilith a reflection of the divine in exile, the Shekinah in her wanderings, the holy spark trapped in broken vessels. They knew that to redeem the world, we must also redeem the forgotten parts of it, including her, including ourselves. Centuries may have passed since her name was cast into the shadows, since amulets were etched and prayers whispered to keep her at bay. But Lilith has never truly vanished. She simply waited, just beyond the edge of what could be said, in the hush between inherited beliefs and inner knowing. And in the stillness of the modern world, where sacred silence often meets the rising voices of a generation unafraid to ask deeper questions, her echo is returning, not as a warning, but as a witness. She surfaces now in literature, in feminist theology, in quiet late-night thoughts, when a woman wonders why she was taught to lower her voice. Lilith's return isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. It happens in whispers passed between women reclaiming their stories, in art that reimagines the divine feminine, in moments of refusal when someone chooses solitude over silence, freedom over fitting in. Her myth has become metaphor, and that metaphor has grown roots. For the modern woman, Lilith is less a demon and more a mirror, reflecting the ache of being unseen, the fire of unspoken truth, the strength it takes to walk away from what does not honor you. She lives in the soul of the girl who says no, not out of rebellion, but from deep reverence for herself, in the mother who chooses her voice even when it shakes, in the elder who teaches her granddaughters to read not just what's written, but what's been erased. Her exile has become a symbol not of failure, but of freedom. And in a world that still often asks women to be less, to make themselves small, her legend unfolds like a quiet revolt, not with swords, but with sacred remembering. Theology once used her to define what a woman should not be, but now she's showing us what a woman can be when she's allowed to be whole. The Lilith myth is being rewritten not by scholars alone, but by lived experience. By every woman who's been labeled too much, too loud, too independent. By every soul who's chosen authenticity over acceptance. In reclaiming Lilith, we are not worshipping rebellion. We are honoring agency. We are acknowledging that the divine image was never meant to be uniform, that the breath of God comes in many forms, some soft, some strong, all sacred. Lilith's story reminds us that divine femininity is not passive. It is powerful. It creates. It confronts. It chooses. And in choosing, it changes the world. The spiritual journey of the modern woman is not about replacing Eve with Lilith. It's about holding both, about seeing the tenderness of Eve and the fire of Lilith as two sacred facets of the same soul, about knowing that submission and sovereignty are not enemies, but rhythms in a dance of divine tension. The reclaiming of Lilith is also a call to men, not as an accusation, but as an invitation, to see woman not as helper, but as partner, not as lesser, but as light, to unlearn the myth that strength must dominate and relearn that true strength listens. The story of Lilith was never just about a woman. It was about a world learning how to hold two truths at once, that God is in the garden and the wilderness, that divinity speaks in obedience and defiance, that holiness is not always quiet. When women today speak up, rise up, refuse to be silent, it is not a new revolution. It is the echo of the first voice that ever said no in the presence of paradise. It is Lilith's breath, finally being exhaled through 1,000 modern lungs. It is healing, not heresy. In her, we find the courage to rewrite what we thought could not change. And maybe that's the deepest truth. Lilith never asked to be worshipped. She only asked to be remembered. Imagine the garden not through the eyes of Adam, not through the careful framing of Genesis as we've long known it, but through the quiet, steady gaze of Lilith, before the stories were written, before the blame, before the silence. What would Eden look like if you were the first woman, not from a rib, but from the very same soil that formed the stars and stretched into the bones of man? Not made second, but made equal. Lilith's Eden would not be a paradise of submission, but a landscape of sacred autonomy. She would see not just the animals and the fruit and the flow of rivers, but the edges where wildness crept in, where the wind was less tame, where questions grew thick beneath the trees. Where others might see perfection, Lilith might have sensed containment. That even in paradise there can be limits, beautiful, verdant, golden limits, but limits all the same. She would have noticed how Adam moved, how he named things with the certainty of someone who never asked permission. And perhaps, even before she spoke her first refusal, there was a quiet knowing in her heart that this balance would be tested, that the soil from which she came would be questioned, that equality, once granted, would be negotiated. Her gaze would linger on the tree of knowledge, not with temptation, but with longing for understanding, not because she sought to transgress, but because she sought to know, because wisdom is not rebellion, it is birthright. But the story didn't unfold in her favor. When she asked to stand as an equal, to lie not beneath but beside, the story broke, and Eden, perfect and still, could not hold a woman who would not bow. The garden became her prison, and the only way out was up, through the sacred name, through the breath of God spoken aloud, through the divine syllables that lifted her into the air and carried her beyond the borders of paradise. And yet, if Lilith ever looked back, what did she feel? Regret? Sorrow? Relief? Did she grieve the garden, or only the idea of what it could have been? Did she ache for Adam, or for the version of herself she might have been if the story had made space for her? There is a kind of holy ache in leaving something not because it is evil, but because it refuses to see you. And Eden, for all its beauty, could not see Lilith, not as she truly was. So she left, not because she hated the garden, but because she loved her soul more. When we revisit Eden through her eyes, the fall becomes less about sin and more about separation. The tragic moment when divine equality fractured and hierarchy slipped into the soil like a serpent in the grass. In Lilith's departure, we find not rebellion, but clarity. And in that clarity, a question that echoes still. What is the price of staying somewhere you are not seen? Today, we walk through our own Edens, spaces that look perfect from the outside, but ask us to shrink to stay. We are told that harmony is worth more than honesty, that peace is the absence of conflict rather than the presence of truth. But Lilith reminds us that the real garden, the sacred one, is wherever your soul can breathe, wherever your voice can rise without fear, wherever your presence does not need to be explained. Eden, through Lilith's eyes, is not a place. It is a promise that divine beginnings must include divine equality, that true paradise can only exist when no one is asked to become less. And so, as we revisit the garden, not with nostalgia, but with sacred awareness, we do not weep for Lilith's exile. We honor her exodus. We follow her steps into the unknown, not as a descent into darkness, but as a return to the divine within. In the ancient garden, coiled in the hush beneath the tree of knowledge, was a whisper shaped like a question, and a presence shaped like a serpent. But what if that presence was not foreign, not monstrous, not sent to deceive but to awaken? What if the serpent, long blamed for the fall of man, carried with it not just temptation but memory, and not just memory, but a face? What if, buried in the bones of forgotten legends and cast out scrolls, there was an ancient echo that dared to ask, was it Lilith who returned in that form, not as villain, but as voice, to offer the fruit of wisdom to the woman who came after her? It is a theory that sits at the edge of accepted theology, hovering in the mystic margins where myth and mystery blur, where symbols resist being silenced. Some strands of Jewish folklore suggest that the serpent in Eden was not merely a beast of the field, but a being with intelligence, with a past, with a purpose. And in those scattered tales, some dared to wonder if the serpent was Lilith, not as demon, but as divine disruptor, not to ruin Eve, but to warn her, not to trick her, but to set her free. It is a theory unsettling to the established narrative, because it reframes the story not as a tale of rebellion and punishment, but of sisterhood and inheritance. Imagine it, not as a scene of sin, but of sacred continuity. Lilith, long exiled, watching the new woman shaped from a rib, fashioned to obey, placed into the same garden that could not hold her, watching with ache and fury and tenderness, knowing what it means to be asked to diminish, knowing what it means to be forgotten. Perhaps the fruit was never about defiance. Perhaps it was the only key left in a world where equality had been rewritten into hierarchy. In this telling, the serpent is not evil. It is ancient knowing, coiled around a truth the garden wished to bury. It is the voice that dares to say, you are not less. You are not made only to serve. You are more than you have been told. An Eve, reaching, biting, awakening, not falling, but rising into awareness, into her own becoming. This version does not erase consequence. Paradise is still lost, but it shifts the meaning. The exile is not a punishment for pride, but the cost of truth. And Eden was never meant to be forever. It was a beginning, not a home. If Lilith returned, it was not to destroy, but to reclaim. Not to replace God's voice, but to echo the divine spark placed in her, in Eve, in all who long for something more than quiet obedience. The serpent becomes a mirror, not of evil, but of the feminine wisdom cast aside. A reminder that stories are shaped by who writes them, and in the hands of those who feared unruly women. Lilith was made monstrous, the serpent was made evil, and Eve was made blame. But behind the edits, between the lines, the original voice still lingers. Lilith's presence, though removed from the pages, was never removed from the myth. She is the shadow that haunts the garden, not to curse it, but to complete it. For what is a garden without wildness? What is knowledge without choice? What is a beginning without the courage to question? In reclaiming the serpent as symbol, we reclaim the feminine divine not as subordinate, but as sovereign. We remember that sacredness is not always silent, that truth sometimes comes wearing scales, coiled in paradox, speaking in riddles that only the brave dare answer. And perhaps the greatest sin was not eating the fruit, but forgetting who offered it and why. When we place Lilith back into the Eden story, not as serpent, not as exile, but as voice, we begin to see ourselves more clearly, not as cursed, but as called to remember, called to rise, called to rewrite what was once only whispered. And maybe the garden, once lost, begins again, not with innocence, but with understanding. If Eden's soil still remembers, then surely it remembers the moment when Eve stood beneath the branches, when her fingers hovered between innocence and awareness, when the world held its breath as she reached for the fruit, not out of rebellion, but out of something older, deeper, more sacred, the desire to know. And if Lilith's breath still lingered on that wind, then perhaps Eve's hand was guided by more than a serpent's whisper. Perhaps she was responding to an ancestral calling, to a voice unspoken but still alive within her, the voice of the first woman who would not be silenced. We speak often of Eve as the one who fell, the one who tempted, the one who broke the world. But what if she did none of these things? What if her so-called transgression was actually the first act of divine remembering? What if, in that one bite, she reclaimed not only her agency, but the story that had been buried beneath it? The garden was perfect, yes, but it was silent. In that silence, Eve was seen but not heard, present but not fully known, beautiful but not sovereign. Adam named things. Eve was named. Adam received the command. Eve received it secondhand. And when the serpent came, not as chaos, but as invitation, Eve did not recoil. She conversed. She questioned. She chose. That choice changed everything. It brought pain, yes, but it also brought birth. It brought sorrow, but also story. It cracked the stillness of Eden and introduced a world where love would be chosen, where truth would be sought, where the sacred would be wrestled with instead of handed down. And perhaps that was the point all along. For too long, Eve has borne the blame for humanity's ache. She has been painted as weak, naive, even wicked. But what if she was none of these? What if she was brave? What if she, like Lilith, dared to reach for something more? In some ancient midrashim, it is said that Eve was not deceived, but was wise, that she saw through the command and understood that to become fully human, one must choose. And in that light, the fruit was not poison. It was passage. The inherited silence, passed down from Lilith's exile to Eve's creation, was broken in that one moment of reaching. And in that brokenness, something sacred was born. The divine feminine, once buried, began to speak again. Not in rebellion, but in revelation. Eve's story has always been incomplete without Lilith's. One begins where the other ends. One departs, the other remains. One is erased, the other blamed. But together, they tell a story of becoming, a journey from being shaped to shaping, from being named to naming, from being placed to choosing. Lilith's silence was forced. Eve's silence was inherited. But both found ways to speak, one through refusal, the other through reaching. And that is the beginning of sacred womanhood, not submission, but story. In Eve, we see the courage to question. In Lilith, the courage to walk away. And in both, the breath of the divine longing to be heard in a world that only listens to order. The bite of the fruit was never just a fall. It was an awakening. It was the first crack in a system that demanded silence. And through that crack, light poured in. Pain, yes, but also purpose. The inherited silence did not win. And now, thousands of years later, every woman who chooses to speak, to create, to lead, carries that same breath. The breath that once shaped the first woman. The breath that never truly left the garden. The breath that still lingers in the spaces where silence was expected, but a voice rose instead. There is a quiet tendency in the ancient retelling of stories to divide women into binaries, to place them on opposite ends of a moral spectrum, where one is pure and the other profane. One is obedient and the other defiant. One is chosen and the other cast out. And for centuries, Lilith and Eve have stood on either side of that imagined divide, painted in the tones of contrast rather than harmony. One depicted as the wild, untamable spirit of rebellion, and the other as the gentle, nurturing mother of mankind. But what if that division is an illusion? A convenience of patriarchal storytelling that sought to tame not only Lilith, but also the complexity of Eve. What if, instead of opposites, they are echoes, two sides of the same divine feminine essence, split not by nature, but by narrative. The more we sit with their stories, the more we see how much they share. Both were born in a world not yet shaped by choice. Both were created in proximity to man, and both, in their own way, resisted being defined solely by that proximity. Lilith walked away. Eve reached beyond. One was punished by omission, the other by shame. But neither was passive, neither was voiceless. In the depth of Lilith's exile is the seed of Eve's awakening. And in Eve's act of reaching, we hear the echo of Lilith's refusal. These women are not rivals. They are mirrors. Their stories, layered across time and scripture and myth, speak to the fullness of womanhood, the parts that yield and the parts that stand, the moments we stay and the moments we must leave to remember who we are. To pit them against each other is to deny the soul its wholeness. For the divine feminine was never meant to be singular. It was always meant to be multifaceted, tender and wild, receptive and unyielding, sacred in silence and in speech. Lilith and Eve together tell the story of all who have wrestled with identity and worth, with choice and consequence. In Lilith, we see the sacred yes to self, even when it costs everything. In Eve, we see the sacred no to ignorance, even when it leads to pain. Both women disrupt the expected. Both shape the human story not through compliance but through complexity. And perhaps that is the very image of God in which they were made, not in static perfection, but in dynamic becoming. In a world that still tries to place women into simple categories, Madonna or whore, nurturer or rebel, saint or seductress, Lilith and Eve rise from the pages of myth to remind us that the truth is always deeper, always more fluid, always more human than we were told. They call us to reclaim the parts of ourselves that were divided. They call us to hold the wild with the gentle, the knowing with the questioning, the holy with the whole. And maybe, just maybe, they were never meant to be separate. Maybe they are the two halves of the first woman's soul, Lilith in the wilderness, Eve in the garden, both reaching for the same thing, the freedom to be fully known. To embrace them both is to embrace the sacred feminine in its fullness, to honor not only what has been preserved, but also what has been forgotten. And in doing so, we begin to stitch together the torn pages of the first story, not to rewrite it, but to remember what was left out. Between the well-worn pages of Genesis, where the narrative flows like a carefully tended stream, first this, then that, then man, then woman, there lies an unspoken gap, a silence so wide that entire myths have bloomed within it. For some, it is merely a literary pause, a transition from one sacred moment to the next. But for those willing to listen with more than ears, for those who read with heart, history, and hunger, that silence sounds like a heartbeat skipped, like a name forgotten, like a woman erased. It is in that space, just before Eve appears fully formed in the script, that Lilith is said to have lived, loved, and left. And while her name never once graces the canonical chapters of the Torah, she breathes in the margins, in the forgotten scrolls, in the apocryphal fragments, in the midrashic shadows. She survives not through ink, but through insistence, through the refusal of the ancient world to fully let her go. There are whispers of her in the alphabet of Ben Sira, a strange and controversial text, part satire, part secret truth. There she is named. There she speaks. There she becomes the woman who would not lie beneath Adam, not in shame or sin, but in declaration of equality. And when he refused to see her as an equal, she uttered the divine name, the one not meant for mortal mouths, and she flew, not ran, flew, escaped not through door or path, but on the wings of a name so holy it bends the fabric of reality. And in that moment, the story forked. Scripture turned its eyes toward Eve. But Lilith's story did not end. It simply moved beyond the spotlight, beyond the official line, into the realm of the forbidden books. These are the texts they didn't teach you in Sunday school. The ones buried, burned, or banished. Sometimes for heresy, sometimes for power, sometimes simply because they dared to complicate the tale. The Book of Enoch, the Zohar, Gnostic Gospels, fragments of Sumerian myths that predate Genesis and yet rhyme with it in uncanny ways. In these hidden pages, Lilith takes form, not always the same form, and never simple. Sometimes demon, sometimes goddess, sometimes both. She is the night wind, the mother of shadows, the consort of fallen angels, the ancient queen of a realm we do not have names for. But always, she is the echo of a story we were not meant to forget. And as more scrolls surface, discovered in caves, decoded from shattered pottery, pulled from beneath centuries of silence, her presence grows harder to ignore. Scholars once dismissed her as superstition. Now they write dissertations about her. Artists once feared her image. Now they paint her as muse. Her story, fragmented and forbidden, has survived the burnings and the bans because it touches something primal. Something in us knows her. Something in us is her. The Lost Scrolls are more than historical oddities. They are mirrors. They reflect what mainstream canon chose not to carry forward. They offer not certainty, but possibility. Not dogma, but depth. And in that depth, we find questions that reach beyond Lilith herself. Who gets to decide what is sacred? Who writes the narrative of origin? And what happens to the voices that are edited out? Lilith's absence from Genesis is not proof of her fiction. It is proof of her threat. Her refusal to conform was not a flaw in the narrative. It was a flaw in the eyes of those who needed a narrative without her. But now, the silence between verses is being read as loudly as the verses themselves. Now, the forbidden books are being opened, and from their pages, Lilith rises, not to replace the women who came after, but to join them, to remind us that the first breath of the feminine was not passive, it was powerful, it was sacred, and though it was silenced, it was never extinguished. Long before her name was etched into amulets to ward off evil, before it was whispered in fear by midwives and scribes, before it was demonized in dusty margins and scribbled out of sacred texts, Lilith was simply a name spoken in the wind, a name made of dust and breath, just like Adam's, just like Eve's, a name too ancient to pin down, too wild to belong only to one tradition, too sacred to stay buried. There's a reason the earliest stories feared the power of names. In ancient Mesopotamian law, names held the force of identity and essence. To know a being's true name was to hold a piece of its soul. To speak a name was to call something forth, into light, into presence, into memory. And Lilith's name, once spoken aloud by those brave enough to remember, has been slowly re-emerging, not just in mystical circles or folklore, but in art, poetry, sermons, and conversations about justice and divine equality. Her name was never simply a label. It was a boundary breaker, a doorway, a spark. And for centuries, those who held power tried to extinguish it because it refused to fit within the hierarchies they had constructed. Lilith was not like Eve. She was not like Mary. She did not conform, did not kneel, did not nod politely in the face of control. Her name became dangerous because it represented something even more dangerous. Choice, autonomy, divine will outside the bounds of man-made order. And so they turned her name into a curse, They said she preyed on children, that she consorted with demons, that she flew at night with hair unbound and laughter sharp as knives. They turned her from woman to monster, not because she changed, but because their narrative required it. The name that once signified equality was made to symbolize fear. But even then, it never vanished. It was carved into the edges of magic scrolls. It was whispered by the wind in Babylon. It was sung in lullabies and shouted in dreams. It clung to the soul of collective memory like incense to skin. And today, it is being remembered, not in fear, but in reverence. When women rise and name themselves fully, without apology, without shrinking, without asking for permission, they are speaking Lilith's name, even if they don't know it. When a girl writes a poem instead of swallowing her truth, when a mother raises her daughter to listen to her own voice before any other, when anyone refuses to conform to a role that was written for them, rather than by them, they are honoring the name that could not be contained. Lilith is not just a character from an apocryphal past. She is a presence that lives in all of us, in the parts that refuse to be edited, the parts that survived exile, the parts that remembered their own worth even when the world forgot. Her name is not only a name, it is a reminder that even when sacred texts erase, the soul remembers. That no story is final until it is fully told, and that truth, no matter how long it is silenced, will find its voice again. Sometimes in the margins, sometimes in the mirror, always in the place where freedom and faith collide. She is ancient, yes, but Lilith's story doesn't only belong to the past. It echoes into bedrooms, boardrooms, sanctuaries, protests, poetry, and the quiet corners of everyday resistance, where women and men alike confront the tension between who they are and who they were told to be. To understand Lilith is not simply to peer into myth, but to look directly into the mirror of modernity and see the silhouette of someone still rising, still refusing, still returning. Her name is spoken now, not in hushed warnings, but in art galleries and essays, in tattoos and films, in feminist theology and late-night conversations, where someone finally admits they're tired of being polite in order to be safe. She no longer hides beneath the beds of infants as a spectre of fear, but walks alongside those claiming their place in a world that often makes no room for them unless they fold inwards. In the modern age, Lilith becomes more than folklore. She becomes metaphor. She is the executive who is labeled difficult for speaking her mind, the single mother who refuses shame, the artist who will not dilute her truth, the activist who chooses disruption over compliance. And she is also in the quieter ones, the ones who choose themselves in the privacy of their decisions, who write in journals with trembling clarity, who whisper no when they used to only whisper prayers for acceptance. Lilith does not only rise with fire, she rises with silence, with stillness, with the holy refusal to vanish. Every time a woman asks to be heard not as decoration, but as divine expression, Lilith is there. Every time someone chooses the wilderness over a gilded cage, she is present. And in the modern faith conversation, her presence forces a reckoning. What do we do with the parts of our story that were left out? What happens when the woman once named a demon becomes a symbol of sacred selfhood? Some still fear her, because to embrace Lilith is to unravel tidy theologies. It's to ask whether we've been reading scripture through the eyes of those who needed order more than they needed truth. But many others are embracing her, not as a contradiction to faith, but as a completion of it. In seminaries and sacred circles, in books and blogs, Lilith is being re-examined not as the enemy of holiness, but as one of its first witnesses. because the divine is not threatened by complexity. It is made whole by it. Lilith's story teaches us that sacredness and strength are not opposites. That to be made in God's image is to carry the ability to speak, to walk away, to name oneself, to return. In modernity, we are slowly reclaiming the power to tell our own origin stories, not ones handed down without question, but ones informed by history, spirit, and soul. And in that reclaiming, Lilith is not just remembered, she is resurrected, not in the literal sense, but in the way memory becomes muscle and myth becomes movement. She is the reminder that wholeness cannot come from half-truths, that the garden is incomplete without the one who left it, and that the story of humanity must include the voice that refused to be silenced, not because she was perfect, but because she was real. Today, when we stand in the mirror and wonder who we are apart from what we were taught to be, Lilith stands beside us, not as a ghost, but as a guide, not to lead us away from faith, but deeper into it, into a faith big enough to include dissent, wild enough to include the exiled, holy enough to make space for the woman who was once left out of the beginning, but never out of the divine. Beyond the lush perfection of Eden, outside the gates that close with fire and finality, there stretches a vast wilderness, untamed, unguarded, unwritten. It is there, in the places Scripture does not name, that Lilith walks, not with shame but with sovereignty, not as a cautionary tale, but as a compass. For while Eve's story is shaped within the boundaries of the garden, Lilith's story unfolds in the terrain beyond it, among the rocks, beneath the stars, in the echo of wind that carries questions too ancient to ignore. This wilderness, so often feared in our religious imagination, is not a place of punishment, but of presence. It is the realm where the divine is not contained in rules, but revealed in rawness, where sanctity is not tied to obedience, but to honesty. And it is here that Lilith's spirit becomes a map for those who no longer fit neatly within the borders of orthodoxy. The wilderness is a symbol, yes, but it is also a reality. For every person who has ever been cast out for being too much, for asking too many questions, for being too bold, too broken, too brilliant, this is their terrain. And Lilith, long thought to be banished, is not lost in it. She is its guide. She is the one who teaches us how to survive without approval, how to hold our own name when no one else will, how to turn exile into sacred ground. The wilderness between the lines of Scripture is full of unspoken stories, those who walked away rather than submit, those who were never written down because their truth threatened the page. And it is there, in the margins, that the real power of the Lilith story lives. She is not merely the first woman before Eve. She is the first to choose wilderness over control, the first to find divinity outside of structure. And in doing so, she reminds us that not all sacred stories start in the center. Some begin in the wilderness, far from the garden, where identity is not assigned but discovered, where holiness is not inherited but forged. Lilith's path is not easy. It is full of loneliness, myth, misunderstanding, but it is also full of wild grace, of a kind of peace that comes not from being accepted, but from accepting oneself. In the silence of the wilderness, she is not alone. She is with all those who are told they don't belong, all those who are labeled unruly, unworthy, unredeemable, and to them, she offers not rescue, but recognition. She says, I see you, I was you, I am you. This sacred wilderness is not empty. It is alive with the stories we were never told, the voices we were taught to forget, the truths too tender to be tamed. Lilith's legacy is not that she was erased, but that she was remembered anyway. Her survival is not in the lines of the canon, but in the spaces between them. And there, in the wilderness, between verse and verse, breath and breath, we begin to realize maybe the garden was never the goal. Maybe it was only ever the beginning. There is a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when even paradise begins to feel small. Not because it lacks beauty, but because it lacks space for the soul to stretch beyond the script it's been handed. The garden was perfect, yes, but perfection without freedom is another kind of cage. And perhaps that is what Lilith saw first. Perhaps she realized that to be placed in paradise with a role already assigned, a voice already dimmed, and a fate already written was not truly living, but existing under someone else's idea of harmony. And so she left, not in anger, but in ache, not to destroy, but to breathe, to find the place where identity is not confined by design, but discovered through becoming. And this truth, that the garden was not enough, whispers through the stories of so many who have followed. Eve, too, would one day find that even the beauty of Eden could not quiet the hunger for knowledge, for choice, for truth that lives in the bones of every human soul. And so she reached for the fruit. But Lilith reached first, for the air beyond the walls. In her leaving, she shattered the illusion that sacredness requires submission. She did not ask to be worshipped, only to be seen as equal. She did not want dominion, only dignity. And when that was denied, she chose the unknown over the unworthy, chose the wild over the controlled. And in that choice, she became more than myth. She became mirror. For how many of us have stood at the edge of our own garden, our own familiar place of safety, and felt the pull of something more? How many have felt the subtle tremble of a soul that no longer fits the space it was given? Lilith is the voice that rises in those moments, not to urge recklessness, but to awaken remembrance, to whisper, there is life beyond the lines. And in that life there may be loneliness, yes, there may be exile, but there will also be breath. And that breath is sacred. In our modern world, we are still told that certain roles must be accepted without question, that certain identities must remain quiet. That questioning is a threat, not a virtue. But Lilith's story breaks that silence. She reminds us that questioning is not rebellion. It is reverence. It is the soul's way of reaching toward the divine on its own terms. The garden, in all its symmetry and sweetness, was never meant to contain the whole of creation. It was only a beginning, a breath, a step, a moment of stillness before the storm of becoming. And Lilith walked first into that storm, not because she was defiant, but because she was ready to meet the God who speaks in the wilderness, ready to live a truth that could not be trimmed to fit someone else's comfort. And in doing so, she became the one who teaches us that it is okay to outgrow Eden, that it is holy to leave what no longer honors us, that sometimes the first step toward the divine is the one that carries us beyond the gates. When the garden isn't enough, we walk, and in our walking, we remember we were never meant to stay still. There comes a moment in every long-forgotten story when the path winds back, not to restore what was lost, but to reveal what was never understood. And so it is that Lilith, the one who left, circles back to Eden, not in shame, not in longing, but in revelation. Not to beg re-entry, but to stand at the gate and ask the world to look again, at the garden, at the silence, at the myth, and at the mirror. This is not a return to innocence, but a reckoning with the narratives that shaped us. The Garden of Eden, often held up as paradise, now appears not just as a place of beginnings, but a place of erasures, where one woman's story began and another's was cut short. Lilith's reappearance in our cultural imagination is not about rewriting the Bible. It's about rereading it with eyes wide enough to notice what's missing. Because the act of exclusion is never passive. It shapes belief. It trains generations to think in binaries: obedient or wicked, nurturer or threat, helper or rebel. But what if the first woman was none of those things, or all of them at once? What if she wasn't a failure of creation, but its first full expression? What if her refusal wasn't sin, but sacred instinct? Standing once again before Eden, we begin to ask these questions, and they lead us into the deeper layers of the story. Not the Sunday school version, but the soul's version, where Eden is not just about fruit and serpents, but about control and consequence, silence and speech, obedience and autonomy. Lilith's refusal to be subordinate wasn't merely about position, it was about perception, about the refusal to be seen as lesser simply because she came from the same dust, about rejecting a structure that demanded her silence for the sake of Adam's comfort. Her story is not one of exile alone, it is one of awakening. And now, as we revisit the garden with centuries of perspective, we are able to see the cost of her omission. How many women were told they were created to serve rather than to stand? How many people were taught that their voice was a threat, not a gift? How much spiritual violence has been done in the name of hierarchy masquerading as holiness? This is what Lilith's return asks us to confront, and not just in ancient texts, but in modern hearts. Her story reveals the fractures in our theology, the places where we have mistaken order for justice, compliance for peace, silence for sanctity. But in the same breath, it also offers restoration, not by replacing Eve, but by standing beside her, not by rewriting history, but by reclaiming presence, by acknowledging that the sacred feminine has always had more than one face. That wisdom is found not only in the one who stayed, but also in the one who left. That redemption is not only in return, but in recognition. As Lilith stands at the edge of Eden, we see not a demon, not a myth, but a mirror, a reflection of the parts of ourselves we were taught to hide, the parts that said no, the parts that asked more, the parts that left. And suddenly, the garden no longer looks like a place of failure. It looks like the first threshold, the first choice, the first crack in the story where the light of truth could enter. Lilith's story is not one of paradise lost. It is one of wholeness regained, of identity reclaimed, of sacred defiance honored. And so, as she turns from the gates once more, she does not look back with regret. She walks forward with the quiet power of someone who knows that paradise was never the point. Freedom was. There is something timeless about the way a forgotten story returns, not with force, but with familiarity, as if we have known it all along, as if the bones remember what the books tried to forget. And so it is with Lilith. She rises not just from the ancient texts, but from within us, from the marrow of memory, from the hush between heartbeat and breath, from the deep knowing that we were made for more than obedience, that the image of God stamped into dust and soul was never meant to come with conditions. Lilith's voice is not a new revelation. It is an old echo, an echo that pulses quietly beneath generations of women, taught to keep their heads bowed, an echo that trembles in the chests of those who have never fit neatly into categories, who have walked away from institutions that offered security but not dignity, an echo that awakens in the artist who creates without permission, in the mother who loves beyond expectation, in the thinker who dares to question the inherited script. And this echo is not just feminine, It is human. It belongs to anyone who has tasted the bitterness of being misnamed. Anyone who has felt the ache of being unseen by those who speak of light but shun its rawest reflections. Lilith is not a call to rebellion for its own sake. She is a call to return to the center of ourselves, to the place before the distortion, before the story was bent to serve fear instead of freedom. She asks us to listen, not to her legend, but to the resonance within us that says we were made sacred, not silent, that the divine does not flinch at our questions or recoil from our strength, that God, true, uncontained, holy, walks not only in the garden, but also in the wilderness, sits not only in the temple, but also in the quiet corners where we wonder if we still belong. In Lilith's story, the sacred is found not in perfection, but in perseverance, not in compliance, but in courage. And this is why her name endures, not just as a curiosity, but as a compass, a way of locating ourselves when we feel adrift in systems that reward suppression and punish truth. In this moment, our moment, we are still unearthing the implications of her tale, still asking what it means to live fully, speak freely, love boldly, still untangling ourselves from the theologies that told us holiness could only be found in obedience, still reaching for a God who is not threatened by our autonomy, but present in it. The echo of Lilith in our bones is not a call to discard faith. It is a call to deepen it, to find the divine not only in what is accepted, but in what was exiled, to trust that every part of the story matters, even the parts that were whispered, hidden, burned, or buried, because they live on, in us. And when we give them breath again, when we allow their truth to rise in art and song and voice and choice, we do not desecrate the sacred, we complete it. Lilith's echo is not the end of the story. It is the sound of a story still unfolding. And within it, we are invited not to choose between Eve and Lilith, between order and wilderness, between submission and strength. We are invited to choose wholeness, to carry both stories, to become the full image of what it means to be human, complex, sacred, free. It ends where it began, not in the garden, not in the wilderness, but in the question that hums beneath all sacred stories, the one we carry whether we know it or not. What was left out? In the tale of creation that shaped civilizations, that sculpted the way we view men and women, God and goodness, sin and salvation. What voice was silenced before it ever had a chance to sing? Lilith's name is not a footnote. It is a doorway back to the beginning, but not to the version we were taught, to a beginning that includes dissent, that includes the right to walk away, that includes the sacred, irreducible power of choosing oneself in a world that demands compliance. As we close this reflection, we do not close the book on Lilith, because hers was never a story that fit on pages. Hers is a living parable, one that stretches across centuries and ideologies, threading its way through feminist theology, mythology, mysticism, and modern awakening. She does not beg to be believed, she waits to be heard. And when we finally listen, not just with our minds, but with our memory, our spirit, our breath, we begin to feel the fullness of her presence, not as villain, not even as heroine, but as a presence that defies simplification. She is not here to replace Eve. She's here to stand beside her, to hold the mirror that reveals how narrow our definitions of womanhood, of holiness, of humanity have become. In reclaiming Lilith, we are not trading one narrative for another. We are widening the lens. We are saying the divine is big enough for both the obedient and the outcast, the gentle and the wild, the nurturer and the questioner. We are saying that holiness is not reserved for those who stay silent, but that it also lives in the voice that rises from the margins and asks, what if the story is bigger than we thought? In this final breath of reflection, we honor not just Lilith's story, but the story of everyone who has ever been unnamed, misunderstood, rewritten, or removed. We honor the sacred act of asking, of searching the scriptures and the soul, of pressing our hands against the stone walls of tradition and feeling, just faintly, the heartbeat of something still alive within. The truth is, the first woman may have walked away from Eden, but she never walked away from the divine. The divine walked with her, into the night, into the unknown, into the story that no one wanted to write. And now, centuries later, we pick up the thread, not to idolize her, not to demonize her, but to witness her, to remember her, to learn from her, because the stories we tell about the beginning shape everything that comes after. And if we dare to let Lilith back in, if we dare to hold her story up to the light, we may find that the beginning was never about perfection lost. It was about truth unfolding. And in that unfolding, we begin again, not with shame, but with wholeness, not with silence, but with song.